We'd like to take a look one more time, if we can, just a little bit at the Muslim presence in Europe and the riddle of the Muslim presence in Europe, of these now nearly 20 million people by some documented count, and I'm sure it's a lot more than that.
I'm sure it must be more because the statistics don't include illegals.
Exactly. And it's these people, to me, it's a riddle of people who flee the fire but bring it with them. Yeah. There is a kind of a puzzle, because if you leave Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia or wherever, or Egypt, and you brave the Straits of Gibraltar, many of them, on these rickety boats and crash the gates of Europe, you would think that they want a European life. But then once they arrive in Europe, they want a non-European life. I'll give you one little experience I had some years ago. I was asked to do a detailed study of Al Jazeera and its broadcasting for the New York Times Magazine. And for my sins, I was supposed to spend something like 60 or so hours listening to Al Jazeera. Well,
you have my deep compassion.
Exactly. But you know what? Interesting enough, I became an addict to Al Jazeera, and I ended up listening to a lot more. And I saw this American tradition going to Al Jazeera, which is the call-in show. And one thing that attracted me was that when people called from Yemen or from Morocco or from Syria, from the autocracy of Syria, they were really reasonable people. They worried about schooling for their children. They worried about the Islamists distorting their culture. Mm-hmm. And when people called from Copenhagen or from Stockholm, they were completely radical. So you'd have a man, let's say, named Ahmed al-Shami, Ahmed from Damascus, more or less. He's in Denmark, and he says, I am in Denmark. I am in Bilad al-Kufr. I am in the lands of unbelief. Well, my attitude was, not quite. You're in the lands of the Danes, and you should live by Danish rules. And so we saw this in the case of the Danish cartoons crisis, right, when Jylland Posten, the newspaper, asked for these cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, and the Muslims in Denmark were the ones who led the charge against their own, if you will, adopted society. So what is one to make of this presence that's building, this Islamic presence in Europe?
Well, there are different ways of looking at it. One that I hear with increasing frequency is that this is a case of third time lucky. Yes. The Muslims tried twice in the past to conquer Europe. The first time was with the first Arab expansion, when they conquered North Africa, which was then part of Christendom. They crossed into Europe, they conquered Sicily, Spain, Portugal, invaded France, and after a long struggle they were driven back. The second attempt came when the Turks conquered Anatolia, which was then a Christian country, captured Constantinople, and invaded Europe, twice besieged Vienna, and then were driven back. According to this perspective, this is the third attempt, using a different method, but with more likelihood of success. There is, I think, another point which is more important in discussing the question of acceptance and assimilation. That is, there's a very crucial difference between Europe and the United States. To become an American means a change of political allegiance. To become a Frenchman or a German is a change of ethnic identity.
So you and I became Americans. It was easy, yes, relatively speaking.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's much more difficult.
Yes.
And for many people, it's impossible. I noticed again and again and again the difference in attitudes to naturalization and to the naturalized citizen. In America, I feel that the naturalized citizen is really accepted. People are offended if, as a naturalized American, you don't say we when talking about America. In England, it's rather the other way around. If a naturalized Briton says we, people tend to fidget uncomfortably and feel, what the devil does he mean by talking about we?
They think that it's presumptuous to say we.
Presumptuous,
yes,
exactly. I mean, the laws regarding naturalization are exactly the same in America and in England.
Right.
5 years residence, good behavior, and it's more or less automatic. But the attitude of the native to the naturalized citizen is very different. And I can say this from personal experience both ways, as it were.
exactly. Well, what's interesting to me about the Europeans, in a way, each European society has recently had a moment of reckoning about the Muslim populations, and we can go through them. On March 11, 2004, 10 bombs tore through these trains in Madrid at rush hour. And, this was the largest terrorist incident in Europe since World War II. It hit Madrid. And I described it, I wrote something about it and said, well, if the Muslims left the Iberian Peninsula and left Granada on January 2, I believe, 1492, this was something of a return. And there is, of course, the famous story of Boabdil, the last Muslim ruler of Granada, standing on a hill and taking a final glimpse at his domain, El Ultimo Sospiro del Muro, the Moor's last sigh, where he sighs over the domain he lost. Right. Well, more than 5 centuries later, there is, if you will, a return. I mean, this moment of reckoning for the Spaniards was very important. Now, in the case of Holland, which is the ultimate in liberal societies and pledged itself to assimilation and liberalism, it was the murder of Theo van Gogh by a Moroccan immigrant, a Dutch citizen of Moroccan background. All the accounts say that he slit his throat in the public, as one eyewitness said, as a man slashes a tire, and then kicked him and refused to apologize for what he did. Then, in the case of England, there was the famous episode of the London Underground on July 7, 2005, and it was done by 4 young men from I believe West Yorkshire who pulled off that deed. So I think Europeans have begun to understand the challenge that's presented to them.
Yes.
I see Nicolas Sarkozy as an answer to that kind of challenge. Am I? Yeah. Is that?
That is one possible answer. Yes. This feeling, of course, that any country which has once been part of the House of Islam must be restored to it is very strong. At one time, I was working on Moroccan embassy reports from Europe. The Moroccans sent a number of embassies to Spain and France and elsewhere. And whenever they mention a place, they always add the formula, may God speedily restore it to Islam.
Right.
And you find the same thing in the East, where the Turks occupied a small part of Poland for a relatively short period. Right. But that was nevertheless regarded as former Islamic territory, which must be restored.
Right. Well, I think it all depends. I mean, I think the answer to this dilemma lies not so much in Muslim behavior in Europe, it lies in European behavior.
Well, it lies in both.
Well, it lies in the sense, I guess it depends on what these societies ask of the newcomers.
That's true, yes.
If you ask of them loyalty, if you demand that from them as the price of being there, well, that's one thing. But if you just grant them the freedom to do whatever they want to do, that's a very different story. And I think that's what Europe, I mean, I think the Europeans have always had this idea recently that there is a face-off, there is a encounter, a confrontation between America and Islam, and that they have nothing to do with it. Well, they're the battleground. They have a lot to do with it. So it doesn't just simply have to do with American power. It also has to do with the Europeans.
Oh, yes, they are the battleground, as you say.
Right. I mean, take, like in the case of Denmark, I mean, I followed the case of the Danish cartoon crisis and the Danish response because a friend of mine, I think you may even know him, Fleming Rose, was the editor who was involved in this crisis. And I talked to Fleming at length about it. Indeed, the Danes responded very bravely in the face of this attacks on them. And they sustained their ground.
Yes.
And it really depends on the Europeans themselves. Will they defend the identity of their own countries?
You get very different answers to that in Europe. Yes. I mean, on the one hand, you have this sort of political correctness,
yes,
which amounts to submission, surrender and submission. On the other hand, you get a sort of quasi-fascist response.
Yes. Well, I think the quasi-fascist response really has to do with the abdication of the liberal response.
Yes, I'm afraid
because,
so.
It's either you respond to it coherently by the law and order of the state, or you just simply allow it to, the only response to it is the kind of the fascist response.
Some years ago, I was invited to participate in a seminar in Berlin, convened by Germans, on the new Muslim minorities in Europe. And I was interested to do that. I agreed. I went there. Some Turks got in touch with me and said that they were having a simultaneous meeting of Turks in Germany, to discuss it from their point of view. Would I like to spend an evening with them? And it was very interesting to see this from the two sides. The German with guests from other European countries and a few from outside, of whom I was one, and the Turks. And the perceptions were totally different.
Right.
They didn't only have different answers to the questions, they had different questions. But what struck me was the totally different way in which they saw this. The Germans who organized this meeting were very liberal, very well-intentioned, very anxious for good relations, very much in favor of acceptance. The Turks were totally unconvinced by this.
They thought it was unneeded.
That wasn't what they wanted, and it wasn't what they expected. And they had also a more gloomy view. A lot of the things which were happening, the Germans thought they were making progressive steps. The Turks I spoke to felt slighted and insulted. And the one I remember most vividly was the final remark of my Turkish host. Speaking of the Germans, he said, in 1,000 years, they couldn't accept 400,000 Jews. Right. What hope is there that they'll accept 2 million Turks?
So they identified themselves, if you will, with the fate of the Jews.
Yes.
Yes.
It was a rather dramatic moment, as
Very.
you can imagine. I hadn't thought of it.
Right. Well, I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, recently there was this debate in France about the right of Muslim women were asserting the right to wear the burqa.
Yes.
And Nicolas Sarkozy said, you can't wear the burqa in a modern society. You can't wear it in this country. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was kind of ironic that you study as we, you much more extensively, we study the history of modernism in Turkey, in Iran, and Egypt, and you have women shedding the veil in the 20s. Like I read a chronicle of Beirut in the 20s, where a very prominent daughter of a very prominent bourgeois judge is talking about veiling and unveiling. And she thought unveiling was a sign of freedom and liberty. So you have people in the 20s and the 30s in the Islamic world asserting the right to unveil, to shed the veil. And then you have these so-called activists in France now asserting the right to wear the burqa. And I think, the way I see it, in many ways, the pillars of this new Islamism, this new attitude, this new hostility to modernism is two things, and I've linked them, which is both the oil money and the welfare state in Europe.
Yes, I agree with you on both points.
Like if you really want to look at what are the material, because there are material bases for everything.
Right.
So what are the material bases of this new Islamism? It's the oil money and the welfare state.
Yes.
And
I mean, any member of a religious community will want to do something to ensure the religious education of his children. Yeah. And there are now large Muslim communities in Europe and in America. And at a certain stage, when their children reach a certain age, they look around to see what's available by way of evening classes, weekend schools, holiday camps, and so on. The sort of thing that the Jews and other religious minorities have been doing for ages. And they look around, and there are such things. And almost all of them are funded by the Wahhabis.
Right.
And the version of Islam that they get is the most radical and violent version.
Absolutely. But also the European welfare state, there is this new book that just came out by Christopher Caldwell called Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, on Islam and in Europe. And there's just a piece of data in it. 2/3 of the French imams are on welfare. Yeah. They're on relief. And if that's the basis of this new Islamism, the basis of this new piety, there you have it. The Europeans are sustaining these furies.
Yes. I mean, if present trends continue, Europe, at least Western Europe, will have a Muslim majority in the not too distant future.
As in Turkey being admitted into the EU, which I don't see.
No, I mean simply by migration and demography.
Right.
I remember not long ago I had a telephone call from an Italian newspaper. They said they wanted to interview me. I said, on what? they said on the question of the increasing Muslim population in Italy, which threatens to become a majority, what should we do about it? So I said the answer is very simple: marry young and have children.
Yes.
And the interviewer just slammed the receiver down. That wasn't what they wanted to hear.
Exactly. That's not exactly. And, you know, that very, very famous writer, Italian journalist, Oriana Fallaci, as we know, got into serious trouble. I got to know Oriana Fallaci, by the way, shortly, unfortunately, just only shortly before her death. And, you know, she may have said some things that were slightly off color. They were slightly provocative, but she was onto something, which is the question of European identity in the face of these new immigrants. And I think that I don't take a dark view of the European future in the face of these Islamists. I think the choice is Europe's to make.
Of course.
The choice is Europe's to make. If it allows the Muslim immigrants, if it allows these Islamists in particular, if it allows them a free run, well, they will just simply run away with things. But if it stops them, if it defends its values, I think these immigrants will draw the proper conclusions that there is a price to be paid for life in Europe, because you want them to accept the requirements of modern life in Europe. I'm thinking there's a quotation I've always loved about one of the 19 hijackers of 9/11. One of them came from my own ancestral country, from Lebanon. Ziad Jarrah was the young boy who was at the control of the jet that these doomed passengers crashed in Pennsylvania. And it was said of Ziad Jarrah, said something which tells it all, I believe. He never missed a party in Beirut, and he never missed a prayer in Hamburg. So you have this young boy of Lebanon, very modern, a very good-looking guy. He went to there were two elite schools in Beirut. One was the prep school of the American University of Beirut, the International College, and one was Al-Hikma, which was Collège de la Sagesse, which was the elite French school. He went to an elite French school. He came from a very good family, and he was a party boy in Beirut, and he ended up in Hamburg, and then this took him on that direction. So a certain kind of Islamism has sprouted in Europe.